You should play Furi. Right now, go play it. The entire game is a treat to play, and seeing any of it is a spoiler. However, if you looked at it and feel unimpressed, then this video is for you. I'm about to make the case for Furi being on the Patrician tier list of games. So what is the Patrician tier? Well, it's hard to quantify because the idea of patrician taste is a very esoteric concept, but in the best way I can explain, patrician tier games are games that either excel in every category or exceedingly excel in a few select categories. That is, the gameplay, the story, the music, the aesthetics. However, patrician does not mean a 10 out of 10 by its very nature. Now, 10s are statistically improbable and no game has ever been one. Patrician games are not always 9s either, though. There are many games I consider patrician that have major flaws that would otherwise hold it back from being among the very best 9 out of 9s. The other defining detail of patrician games is that they are almost always cult classics that tend to ward away contemporary casual gamers from enjoying. In some cases, it'll be popular for the normies to say they love the game, but they haven't actually played it in at least 5 years. Whereas most patricians probably have their personal list of patrician tier games installed at all times and come back to play them regularly. So let's get to talking about Furi. Furi is a difficult action boss fight game in an isometric perspective. What I just said probably scared some of you off, so come back. Furi is difficult, but it is not tedious. It soars over many of the usual design hurdles of boss fight games. It's not going to make you watch that opening cutscene every time you fail to fight. It's not going to throw a random mechanic at you once and then forget about it the rest of the game, and it won't kill you for absolutely no reason just to pad its runtime. In a way, it's most like Metal Gear Rising if MGR decided to cut down on the sections in between bosses. Since MGR's strength was its bosses and the boss structure, that isn't particularly a bad thing. Furi is entirely boss fights, and it's pretty good ones at that. Although its characters lack the eccentricity of some of Metal Gear Rising's. Don't expect to run into anybody like Jetstream Sam while playing Furi. That said, each part of this video series is going to be dedicated to each boss. This is the spoiler warning. Watching this video from here on out will lessen the magic of discovery playing this game, so only keep watching if you are on the fence about playing it. Furi has 2 difficulties to boot, and a third if you play through it entirely on the default difficulty. I typically hate this in action games since the highest difficulty usually afforded to the player is typically kiddie pool mode, so you have to wait for any actual gameplay depth. Not here. Furi is a challenging game on its intended difficulty, Furi. There's also the Promenade difficulty, but this is reserved for either people who are really bad at video games and people who are making videos. I have a quote from Cecilia D'Ansantasio from Kotaku. My issues is that the game is too hard in the wrong ways, and perhaps for the wrong reasons. The premise is bound by a plot thin enough to account for an all-meat kind of game. Yeah, the story is actually pretty good, but since there is no evidence this writer managed to make it past the second boss in the article, I can understand how she got this impression. You're shamed for picking it, this is in reference to the Promenade difficulty, which made me wonder why it was included at all. Really, you're not only shamed for picking it, as much as you're shamed for not being the kind of person who would pick it. I want to emphasize that part of the emergent storytelling of this game is the journey of improvement you undergo, in a series of very personal duels against the jailers. You miss an aspect of that when you decide to turn on the God mode just for story and scenery. You can get the former from a Wikipedia page and the latter from a YouTube video. If you want to play an actual video game and not just watch a movie, then yeah, Furi isn't going to be for you, and the developers want you to know that. I can't help but feel in some small degree that the recent invincibility mode was added to accommodate people like this, which means the young developers at the game bakers are already being corrupted into compromising their vision in favor of appealing to casuals. That is a shame. So what does Promenade difficulty do? Besides state the obvious fact that it's easier when you start it, it seems to reduce the damage bosses do and drastically simplify the phases. Up by my health bar, you'll see the difficulty labeled, and when it's not, that means it's only the default Furi difficulty. Let's go through the phases of the first boss, the Chain.
This has been fun, but it's time to get serious.
Now, since the Chain is the first boss, he has the unfavorable task of being the tutorial boss. This means lots of leaving windows open for you to attack, and sporadic periods of being immune to certain attacks to force you to try new ones. You'll see 5 health bars on Promenade, 7 on Furi difficulty to test you, and then there's Furier. See, there is no point to have a tutorial boss in New Game Plus mode, so it doesn't. The chain is suddenly a real boss who is going to really kick your ass. I've played a lot of this game, so the first 2 difficulties are a cakewalk, but I managed to even get knocked out once on Furi this playthrough. The first half of a fight is dedicated to teaching you the basics. In the first half, you are a shooter. Blasts can negate other basic blasts and you chip away at the health bar. You can also dodge, which has a small delay due to your ability to charge it. Once the enemy hits 0 health, he stances down and you have to slash him to enter the second half of the phase, the melee phase. Here, you melee and parry. This might look easy since the attack is telegraphed and you aren't playing it, but trust me, without the necessary practice, proper timing is rather learned. On Furi, the chain is much more complex. He fires tracking shots, wall attacks that require a charge dodge to completely dodge. You'll also melee attack during the phase with a very fast series of attacks. If the player isn't careful, his final blow can start a quicktime event. Now, I've never cared for stick-waggling quicktime events or QTEs in general, but we are lucky the game is rather lean on how much waggling it expects the player to do. The skill isn't coming from how fast you can waggle the stick, it comes from avoiding getting put into it in the first place. No QTE ever happens in Furi that isn't a punishment for poor performance. In the first melee phase on Furi, the boss will use the wave attack that has to be dodged, which is unfortunately rather finicky to control from this lower perspective. Now, if you're watching this without having played the game, you may have asked, how do the phases work? Every boss has a set number of phases, and then each phase has a shooty section and a stabby section. If you can get through the shooty and stabby sections of a phase, the bar loses 1 health bar, and you regain all your health. And if you lose all of your health, you lose one of those phases on your health bar, and the boss regens their health. If you're missing a bar and you successfully complete a phase, you regenerate 1 additional phase in addition to earning your health back.
You're gonna take some putting back together when I'm done with you.
This is a fantastic way of doing the pacing for a boss fight. Most games, a boss is a mad sprint at the end of a middle distance race. Think of the last 100 meters of an 800 meter race. In this game, the boss is the race, and it's a marathon. Part of the intimidation factor for certain bosses is showing up and seeing a boss have a ton of phases. Inversely, some bosses lend themselves to underestimation at first due to how few phases they seem to have. Being on the very last sliver of health in Furi is less stressful than most games, since at most, you only have to redo the phase. Being on the very last sliver of health on your last health bar, on the other hand, is tense as fuck, and it can be very pleasurable to barely eke out a victory from the brink of death. Failure, of course, means restarting that fight. However, don't get the impression that fights are overly long. Failure on the final phase of a boss isn't a bad thing in the sense that you waste a great deal of time. Each attempt against the chain on each difficulty only took me around 6 minutes. That timer up top, which includes the number of hits and knockouts, is optional, and I encourage you to play with it disabled your first time through. So worst case scenario, if you lose against a boss, you only really lose a couple of minutes. I sort of get the impression from some of the dialogue that the original intention was that death would send you back to the very start of the game, and all the dead bosses would be revived, thus the prison was an endless purgatory. I am kind of glad it doesn't, as that idea sounds good on paper, but in actuality would get tedious on bosses that take a bit of practice to master. Let's try to get back on track. Phase 2 of the chain. The Furi Phase 2 is actually more fair, since the Promenade and Furi have the chain open up with a near undodgeable flurry of shots. Kind of a dick move. Anyways, Phase 2 is about learning to do charge shots and slashes. On Furi, Phase 2 is just Phase 1, on cocaine. Now the boss is shooting out waves of projectiles, boomeranging his staff around the map, and swinging these massive stage-wide strikes. So watch this. The boss goes in for an attack, fakes me out, which gets me to parry, and then attacks me from behind. People misuse the phrase good AI, so let me explain. The AI isn't good in the sense that it's adapting to my strategies. Rather, the AI is given the illusion of true intelligence because it has a wider operational moveset to choose from. So when people say a game has good AI, they are actually referring to the fact that the designers gave the AI a number of options to choose from, instead of scripting it to only do one move. The more you know. I suppose here I have to explain the orange glow in the melee phases. Initially when I started, I had no idea what this did because the game never actually explains it, which I don't particularly mind. This orange glow is a damage multiplier that works for one strike, but requires a charge up and you lose it if you take damage. It's effectively a risky option you can take in melee phases that can either pay off in huge amounts of damage or leave you open to getting brutalized by your opponent. Combining it with the charged melee strike creates even more risk but has more reward. A successful charged melee strike creates this window where you can attack the boss, launching into a brief animation and a bit of extra damage. Think of this as your reward for good performance. You can also trigger this window from perfect parries, again as a reward for good performance. The sad part, however, is that each boss only has one of these animations, and you see it at the end of every fight, so its value as a reward is slightly diminished from seeing the same animation over and over.
Well, that was nothing. I'm gonna teach you some real pain.
Phase 3. Phase 3 in the tutorial version of the chain is all about dodging. Both the shooty and the stabby sections. Dodging is one of the most vital skills in this game. You can't parry every attack, but you can dodge all of them. The dodge has one small problem. It's a charge up, like the melee and shot, but since it's a defensive ability, the game waiting for you to depress the button to activate the ability can be a bit of a liability. While that can be awkward in a pinch, it does mean that parrying is the more responsive defensive ability, meaning that the game does somewhat balance parrying and dodging together. In Metal Gear Rising, parrying was the king of defense, since it could be done so easily and could work against practically every attack. There was never any incentive to actually try dodging the attacks. So initially, I was going to rail against Furi for this design oversight, but I'll let it slide because it does actually work. This is also the first sign of the game's bullet hell genetics. I'm not really a fan of bullet hell games, so I can't say if it's good or not in that regard, but it is really hard in proportion to everything else, and the game really wouldn't work without it. On Furier, Phase 3 is Phase 2 on bath salts. This is standard fare for most bosses. A lot of phases just add additional moves to previous phases. In this phase, the chain slams down this directional attack. Unlike before, however, he tracks you while doing it, leaving you only a small window to actually dodge it. I just want to say that I'm not spoiling the entire experience. There's tons of subtle details and techniques I'm practicing in this fight that I won't explain until much later in the game. Phase 4. After a bit of a power-up sequence, the boss decides he's done teaching you and is going to get serious, to set a tone for what you're in for. He starts using multiple prior moves together. Breaking it down like this, I'm starting to see how well this first boss is designed, even as a tutorial boss. However, there is a fault in my format. Each difficulty has a different number of phases, so explaining all the new moves of each phase is going to start to sound like there's an echo in here. The final phase of a boss is called the Desperation Phase. In this phase, the boss effectively goes all out, using whatever techniques in a, desperate attempt to defeat you. On Furier, Phase 4 is the Desperation Phase. On Promenade, it's Phase 5, and Phase 4 is basically the only real phase that he gets to fight in. On Furi, Phase 4, 5, and 6 are his real phases, and he keeps mixing in new attacks for each one, until Phase 7, which is then the Desperation Phase. I noticed on Promenade that certain trickier attacks like these tracking purple shots, the shotgun attack, and the big purple wave are missing from the fight. That definitely contributes to making the fight easier, although it's worth noting that the Furi and Furier fights were 6 minutes 11 seconds and 6 minutes 14 seconds respectively, while the Promenade fight came in at 3 minutes and 29 seconds. So while you are definitely getting an easier fight, you're also getting a much shorter one. Another thing worth noting is that the Furier version of the chain also has more lines of dialogue, which you miss out on the easier difficulties.
See, even your fucked up breed can bleed. I'm gonna train you like a pig. Don't push your luck. I'm gonna kill you.
The Desperation Phase of the chain, each difficulty has a different one. None of them are really hard, at least not compared to what's coming. The shooty section starts with a series of waves that come at the player, while the stabby section has you dodging a series of directional attacks by an invincible boss. And then you win. Let's talk about the story of Furi. It doesn't just cold open to a boss fight. Furi starts with you, the stranger, getting tortured by the first boss. Then after a bit of taunting, he walks off and this rabbit guy starts talking to you. I know, this is almost too indie, so give me a second. I think at some point there was a core redesign on this game, both in terms of the death mechanic I mentioned earlier, but also in the story. See, the Donnie Darko cosplayer is named The Voice, and he says this line.
I hear thunder. Pitter patter.
This is a really weird line. It sounds like the voice actor wasn't in character and was portraying a radically different, more art house version of the voice. I think some people who considered playing Furi got to that point in a Let's Play and said, nah, this is way too indie for me. You know what I mean? Like pixelated promo material, a synthwave aesthetic and soundtrack. I mean, the game sells its soundtrack separately on Steam, like only pretentious hipster games do that. So I feel like at some point this game was going to be way more indie, and came down from that suicidal ledge to make a better game. Unfortunately, the game is slipping into obscurity, and I think it's due to people misjudging it from its intro. Its legacy at present is that it has a really good soundtrack. That's really the kind of damage one line of dialogue can do.
You were a weapon, a bringer of death. And now, you're nothing. I will keep on killing you. Again and again. I am your future. An eternity of slow, painful deaths.
The chain tortures you and taunts you about the fact that he is going to keep torturing you forever. Then the voice shows up and lets you out and tells you that freedom only requires that you kill the jailer and escape. You aren't given any context about why you're in jail, how long you've been there, or what relation you have to the voice. All this in time. After this, you open to a short sequence where you walk up to the boss arena. Let's talk about the walking segments. So a lot of people hate these walking segments of Furi. They can't be skipped and they punctuate every fight, so people feel they're limiting the player's freedom. This facet is important, so just hold on to it until the very end, because...
Believe me, what's waiting at the end of all this is so worth the trouble.
I do love the voice's lines, except the obvious one. I also love when the writer is competent enough to know the advantages of writing in a video game. For instance, the line,
Bravo! Excellent! What a thrill! Not your first time, right?
takes on a second meaning for players on the Furi or difficulty, since it isn't actually their first time fighting the chain, and a third meaning for players later replaying the game again. And its first meaning does a lot to characterize the stranger as a combat experienced warrior. So lines like these are cool and lose a lot of meaning in linear forms of media like movies. Oh, and a small piece of advice, auto-walking can cause you to lose out on some unique details of levels. For instance, after defeating the chain, instead of walking towards the gate, you can actually go back towards your torture chamber.
Ouch, what a well thought out torture device. Ooh, hurts just to look at it. Lucky for you, I was here. But you're right, take a good long look at this place, because we are never coming back.
I also heard sections of songs that you otherwise wouldn't hear, including on the release versions of them just by walking around the level. There isn't much to do, but little details like that are really impressive to me. Some people have said that Furi has an anemic story. This is only the case because modern games have conditioned people to expect hour-long cutscenes explaining the entire narrative before they get to the tutorial. So when games like Furi come along in medias res and get straight to the gameplay, they are repelled like water off a raincoat.
Our friend here managed to trigger the alarm, so they'll be waiting for you. But no worries, it makes no difference. They've been waiting for you forever. It's all they do.